Welcome everyone. Today we travel back to one of the most dramatic and violent turning points in all of human history, the French Revolution. This is the story of how ordinary men and women, pushed beyond the limits of endurance, rose up and shattered an entire world order. Imagine Paris in the spring of 1789. The streets are narrow, dark, and thick with the smell of rotting grain and unwashed bodies. Bread, the most basic food, has become almost impossible to afford. A common worker in Paris spends nearly 90% of his wages just to feed his family. Children go to sleep hungry. Mothers weep in silence. And yet, just a few kilometers away, in the gilded palace of Versailles, King Louis XVI and his court are dining on elaborate feasts. Chandeliers blaze with thousands of candles. Courtiers in silk and powdered wigs laugh and dance. The contrast is not just unfair. It is obscene. France in 1789 is a country divided into three groups called the estates. The first estate is the clergy, the priests and bishops of the Catholic Church. The second estate is the nobility, the aristocrats with their vast lands and privileges. Together, these two groups own most of the wealth in France, and yet they pay almost no taxes. The third estate is everyone else. Merchants, lawyers, craftsmen, farmers, servants, roughly 97% of the entire population. They carry the full weight of taxation. They feed the nation. And they have almost no political voice whatsoever. For generations, this system had held. People grumbled, but they endured. What changed in 1789 was a combination of factors so devastating that endurance finally became impossible. A series of terrible harvests had destroyed the grain supply. The royal treasury was completely bankrupt, partly from France's costly support of the American Revolution. And a new generation of educated citizens had been reading the works of Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Montesquieu, who argued boldly that all men are born equal, and that governments exist to serve the people, not the other way around. These ideas were like sparks falling onto dry straw. In May 1789, King Louis called together the Estates General, a massive assembly of representatives from all three estates, for the first time in 175 years. He needed their approval to raise new taxes. But the representatives of the Third Estate arrived with something far more radical in mind than simply approving a budget. The Third Estate delegates were furious. Under the old rules, each estate got one vote, meaning the clergy and nobility could always outvote the commoners 2-1, no matter how many people the Third Estate represented. The delegates refused to accept this. After weeks of tense deadlock, on June 17, 1789, the Third Estate made a breathtaking declaration. They announced that they alone represented the French nation, and they renamed themselves the National Assembly. The king locked them out of their meeting hall. So they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. And there, in that plain, echoing room, with the smell of sweat and sawdust in the air, 600 men raised their right hands and swore an oath. They would not disperse. They would not be silenced. They would not stop until France had a proper constitution. History knows this moment as the tennis court oath. Louis XVI was furious. He began moving troops toward Paris. The rumor spread through the city like wildfire, the king was going to crush the assembly by force. Fear and rage boiled together in the streets of Paris. On July 14, 1789, the tension finally exploded. A massive crowd of Parisian citizens, tradespeople, laborers, women who sold vegetables in the market, surged toward the Bastille, a medieval fortress and prison that had come to symbolize royal tyranny. After hours of violent confrontation, the fortress fell. The governor was killed. The prisoners inside, only 7, as it turned out, were freed. But the symbolic power of that moment was enormous. The Bastille had fallen. The king had been defied. And nothing would ever be the same again. Throughout the summer of 1789, the revolution spread from Paris into the countryside. Peasants rose up against their landlords. Noble estates were burned. The old feudal system, which had bound peasants to the land for centuries, began to collapse almost overnight. On the night of August 4, in an extraordinary session of the National Assembly, noble after noble stood up and voluntarily renounced their feudal privileges. By morning, the entire legal structure of aristocratic France had been dismantled in a single night of collective emotion. Then, on August 26, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, one of the most important documents in the history of democracy. It declared that all men are born free and equal in rights. That sovereignty belongs to the nation, not the king. That citizens have the right to liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. These words did not just describe France. They described a new vision of what human society could be. But here is what almost no one talks about when they tell the story of the French Revolution. The revolution did not bring peace. It brought chaos. And out of that chaos came something that the idealistic revolutionaries of 1789 had never intended, a period of systematic, state-sponsored terror. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia. Foreign armies were marching toward Paris. Inside France, counter-revolutionary uprisings were breaking out in regions like the Valais, where Catholic peasants took up arms against the new government. The revolution was under threat from every direction. In this atmosphere of fear and paranoia, a radical faction called the Jacobins seized control of the government. Their leader was a lawyer from the provinces named Maximilien Robespierre, a small, precise, immaculately dressed man with cold green eyes and an absolute, terrifying certainty that he was right. Robespierre believed that the revolution must be defended at any cost. He called this defense the Reign of Terror. From September 1793 to July 1794, the guillotine worked without pause. Thousands of people were arrested on suspicion of being enemies of the revolution. Nobles, priests, merchants, and even fellow revolutionaries who were deemed insufficiently radical, all were brought before the revolutionary tribunal. Trials lasted minutes. The verdict was almost always the same. The blade fell. Again and again and again. Among those who died was Queen Marie Antoinette, who was executed in October 1793. She walked to the scaffold with remarkable composure, stepping accidentally on the foot of her executioner and quietly saying, "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." Even in her final moments, the human detail is what stays with us. In total, historians estimate that between 16,000 and 40,000 people were executed or died in prison during the Terror. The revolution had consumed its own children. Robespierre himself was not immune. In July 1794, his own colleagues turned against him, terrified that they would be next. He was arrested, and within 24 hours, he too was guillotined. The man who had sent so many others to their deaths faced the same blade in the same public square. The crowd that had once cheered for him now jeered. After the fall of Robespierre, France entered a more moderate phase. But the instability continued. Governments rose and fell. And then, in 1799, a young Corsican general named Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup and seized power. Napoleon would go on to reshape Europe through a decade of brilliant, devastating warfare. In many ways, he was both the child of the revolution and its betrayal, carrying its ideals of equality and law across the continent while crowning himself emperor. The consequences of the French Revolution echo across the centuries in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. It destroyed the divine right of kings as a credible political idea. It established the principle that governments must be accountable to their citizens. It inspired revolutionary movements across Latin America, Europe, and beyond. The very vocabulary of modern politics, left and right, citizen, nation, republic, comes directly from the French Revolution. This reminds us that even today, when we vote, when we protest, when we demand that those in power answer for their actions, we are standing in a tradition that was forged in the streets of Paris more than 200 years ago. The idea that ordinary people have the right to shape their own government, that idea was not always obvious. It had to be fought for, bled for, and in many cases, died for. The French Revolution also teaches us something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. Revolutions begin with hope. They begin with genuine grievances and genuine ideals. But when fear enters the equation, when people feel that everything they have fought for is about to be taken away, the capacity for cruelty becomes almost limitless. The same passion for justice that drove men to storm the Bastille also drove them to send their neighbors to the guillotine. This is not a reason to despair. It is a reason to be vigilant. Every generation must ask itself, what are we willing to do in the name of our ideals? And where is the line between defending freedom and destroying it? The French Revolution was not a clean story. It was not a simple story of heroes and villains. It was a story of human beings, flawed, frightened, passionate, and sometimes magnificent, trying to build something new out of the ruins of something old. They did not always succeed. They made catastrophic mistakes. But they also changed the world in ways that still shape your life today. The next time you hear the words liberty, equality, and fraternity, liberté, égalité, fraternité, remember that those words were not given to the world by philosophers sitting in comfortable chairs. They were written in the blood and fire of one of history's most turbulent revolutions, by people who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. History is not made only by kings and generals. It is made by ordinary people who reach a moment when they can no longer stay silent. When the cost of submission finally outweighs the cost of resistance. When a crowd of hungry, desperate, furious human beings looks at a fortress and decides, together, that today is the day it falls.